Friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This Before You Read lecture will focus on Acts chapters 1 through 15. In this lecture, I will highlight or provide rather a brief orientation to the book of Acts in general and to these 15 chapters from the book of Acts. I'll then focus in on the acts of the Holy Spirit as a fitting title for this book as well. I'll then highlight a few of the central moments in Acts 1 through 15, and then give you a couple of questions to consider as you read. I want to start with a brief orientation to the book of Acts. We can, for many reasons, think of Acts as a unique writing in the New Testament, but there are two reasons in particular to think this. First, it is the only writing in the New Testament that is a companion to one of the Gospels. It is a volume 2, part 2 of the Gospel of Luke, and that makes it quite unique. And it is the only narrative in the New Testament that is directly concerned with the early church, that tells the story of the growth of the early church. Of course, Paul's letters are going to touch on early Christian communities, and other letters as well talk about the early church in the sense of a living, breathing thing. But the book of Acts is the only writing in the New Testament that provides this narrative about its birth and its growth. Acts is rightfully considered volume 2 in a 2-volume work attributed to Luke, the evangelist. We can see a number of similarities that make this connection apparent. First, in the very first chapter of Acts, we see a preface very similar to the preface that we see in Luke chapter 1. In addition, there are a number of shared themes in the two writings. We can think about the Holy Spirit. We can think about the work of God, the fulfilling work of God, how God has fulfilled promises of old. We can think about the ways in which both Acts and Luke portray Jesus and the disciples as sort of in the vein of the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament. And at least early in the book of Acts, we see an interest in money and possessions that is similar to what we see in the Gospel of Luke. And so, although these two writings are separated in the New Testament canon by the Gospel of John, it is right for us to think of them as companion volumes, as Acts is picking up the story where the Gospel of Luke left off. And there's actually even a little bit of overlap in these two writings that you'll see. When it comes to the author of Acts, it's very similar to what we've said about the author of Luke. We technically don't know who wrote the book of Acts because it doesn't say who wrote it. Church tradition associates both Acts and Luke with Luke, who was a traveling companion of Paul, mentioned in Acts and in Colossians. And so I'm happy to continue to refer to him as Luke in the vein of this traditional attribution, so long as we recognize that there is no claim of authorship in the book of Acts. When we compare the two writings, there is a fairly widespread consensus that they are written by the same person. The similarities in style and word choice and sentence construction, sort of in the weeds, things about the Greek suggest that it's written by the same author, so that Luke and Acts are written by the same author. It is unclear how, if they were written at the same time, or if there's a gap between when the gospel was written and when Acts was written. But most scholars suggest that both Luke and Acts were written sometime in the 80s or 90s CE. In terms of the genre of Acts, when we think about genre, this is a question of what type of writing is this? We should say at the beginning that Acts contains a number of different elements or types of literature. And so we need to keep that in mind. But I think for my purposes, there are two suggestions about the genre that I think are helpful. The first is made by Greg Sterling, who teaches New Testament at Yale Divinity School. And he suggests that Acts is a form of apologetic historiography. So apologetic historiography. Historiography is the study and writing of history. And history writing was an important endeavor in the ancient world, from the Greeks to the Romans and beyond. And so the telling of history was important. So Acts is a telling of history. But apologetic tells us how that history is told, or even why that history is told. And apologetic comes from the Greek word meaning defense. And so it's a defensive historiography. It's an explanatory historiography. It is telling us with a particular perspective how the early church came to be. And I think one of the important implications of this is it seems as though Acts is told in a way that presents Christianity as not being a threat to the Roman Empire, as not being a threat to that sort of worldview, not a threat to the imperial leaders or even the provincial authorities. Beverly Gaventa, in the HarperCollins Study Bible edition of Acts, describes the book of Acts as a theological narrative, especially because it contains all those various types of literature. And she says that it's a theological narrative. It is ultimately a story about God and about God's dealings with the world. And I love that. Key to this idea of Acts as theological narrative are the speeches in Acts. These are a key feature of Acts. They are a major component of how Acts advances its theological narrative, and they do at least two functions. One is they interpret what's going on in the narrative and describe and proclaim how God is working. But the second is they are major drivers of Luke's own theological message. So Luke uses the speeches to communicate his overall message about God and about what has happened in and among the early church. The second thing I want to talk about are the acts of the Holy Spirit. Now, the title of this book in your study Bible or Bible is probably Acts of the Apostles, but we could just as easily call it the Acts of the Holy Spirit, because really the story is all about the acts of the Holy Spirit, the movements of the Holy Spirit. And this, again, is a place of connection with the Gospel of Luke. You'll remember that the Holy Spirit is everywhere active in Luke chapters 1 and 2. There's mentions of characters being filled with the Holy Spirit, of speaking by the Holy Spirit. And of course, then in Luke 4, Jesus himself is filled with the Holy Spirit as he reads from Isaiah and applies those words to himself and to his own prophetic healing salvation ministry. And there are, in the book of Acts, central moments where we see the Holy Spirit moving, and you might want to pay attention to those. First, in Acts chapter 2, this is the miracle of Pentecost, where the community of believers receive the Holy Spirit and they are able to speak in foreign languages. Then in Acts 8, we see the role of the Holy Spirit in driving disciples to Samaria and to interaction with an Ethiopian eunuch, outsiders who have a transformative role in the larger narrative of Acts. And then, of course, Acts 15, where the early church sort of comes to terms with how to include Gentiles in the church and how the Gentiles will relate to the God of Israel. That all is said to come about because of the Holy Spirit. And so as you read Acts, you can think about the Holy Spirit as a character in the narrative, as a character in and of itself, moving along and communicating and acting in the narrative. But I also think you should look for the ways in which the human characters in the narrative of Acts are sort of catching up to what the Holy Spirit is doing. They're sort of just a moment behind the Spirit's inclinations or the Spirit's movements. And I think that this is an important part of Luke's overall theological vision. Thirdly, I just want to briefly touch on a few of the important moments that you'll encounter in Acts 1 through 15, in addition to the ones that I've already mentioned. The first is Acts 7. This is a very famous speech by Stephen, who is martyred in the book of Acts. He's killed for this speech. And one of the interesting things in this speech is how he summarizes the contents and the message of the Old Testament, and how that summary relates to the story of Jesus as we see it in the Gospel of Luke, and to the story of the church as we see it in the book of Acts. Another place to focus is Acts chapters 9 and 10, and I would call these the story of two conversions. The first is the story of Paul and his own conversion. My guess is this is a familiar and well-known story to you all, but there's an equally important conversion that happens right after that, and that's the conversion of Peter. And Peter's conversion doesn't come from a heavenly light, but it comes from an intimate and transformational encounter with Cornelius, a loyal and God-fearing Gentile. So pay attention to how these two conversion stories relate to one another and the role that they play in the narrative. Finally, you may want to slow down in Acts chapter 15. This is a place in the book of Acts where the church comes to certain conclusions about Gentile inclusion. And I think it's an important place for you to reflect on the deliberation of the early church and how they come to this decision. Finally, as you read, a couple of things for you to pay attention to. The first should come as no surprise. Pay attention to the role of the Holy Spirit. What do you see the Holy Spirit doing? How does the Holy Spirit work? How do the characters of the narrative know that the Holy Spirit is acting? The second thing to pay attention to is really the surprise of Gentile inclusion. Most of us read this as Gentiles, as members who are non-ethnically Jewish. We don't come from a Jewish background. We're not Jewish by birth. And so it's easy to sort of have the idea of Gentile inclusion not seem so shocking or surprising. But I invite you to read Acts 1 through 15 with fresh eyes so that you might see just how surprising and important it was that the church made this decision so that you and I can be in relationship with the God of Israel, even though we are Gentiles. And then a final question as you read, and that is, how might Acts be paradigmatic for us today? How might we read Acts not just as a narrative of the past, not just as a story of the early church's development, but as a way, as a framework for understanding our own world? How might it help us see ways in which we are behind the movement of the Holy Spirit? How might it help us to become more and more inclusive as we learn from the early church and the ways in which they broke certain religious traditions and convictions in order to make a way for non-Jews to be in relationship with the God of Israel? I hope that this Before You Read lecture provides some context to the book of Acts and will help you read the first 15 chapters effectively. Can't wait to hear what you see and what you read. Now get to it.